welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany, and each week we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 10 of The Kill File. Today's story is going to cover the Deathmaker cases, aka Rudolf Pliel. I hadn't heard of this case until I stumbled across it, and his backstory was so interesting to me that I wanted to cover it. There will be some cases here where we're going to go heavy into the background of the victims, and then there's going to be some cases where we go heavy into the killer's background. So this is going to be one of the ones that we go heavy into the killer's background. Trigger warnings for today are murder, rape, sexual assault, suicide, body mutilation, and some brief animal stuff is going to be mentioned as well. This is an interesting one, and it's going to take us way back into the 1920s and 40s, so here we go. Rudolf Pliel was born on July 7th, 1924, in a small village that was said to be near the border of former Czechoslovakia. Rudolf's father was said to be an industrial worker and also a communist, so when the time came for the Nazis to have taken control, his father was arrested. His family was then moved to a place called Vejperti, and while Rudolf was only at the young age of 9, he tried to support his parents, who were unemployed at the time, by border smuggling. This would cause him to be arrested on multiple occasions. One source said Rudolf's dark tendencies had actually surfaced early on when he was said to have killed a cat at the young age of 7. When Rudolf was only 13 years old, he had his first sexual experience with a sex worker, which is just way too young in my opinion, and it kind of makes me sad. With what would only be said to have lasted a few weeks, at the age of 15, Rudolf briefly worked as a butcher in 1939. After this, he worked on barges called Elbe and Oder as a ship boy, which was said to be someone who usually attended the cabins on a barge. During this time, Rudolf was also operating an illegal business. I couldn't find clarity on what illegal business this was or what operations that were illegal that he was doing. During World War II, Rudolf was found to be unfit for him to serve active duty because he was diagnosed with epilepsy. There were many reports that he did serve at a young teenage age in the military, so maybe once his epilepsy was discovered, he could no longer serve. That's just my best educated guess on the matter. At the time, it was apparently the law that those with epilepsy were sterilized. I did not know this, so I had to do a little research. First off, for anyone who doesn't know, epilepsy is considered a brain disorder that causes reoccurring seizures. That is due to abnormal electrical activity in the brain. So when I went into researching about the sterilization, I found that it tied into Hitler's whole eugenics thing. It said after Hitler seized power, the Nazis helped to try and fulfill some long-held aspirations of some proposed eugenics ideations. So a eugenicist is a person, in case you're not sure, is someone who believes that the human race could be, quote, improved by controlled breeding. So basically, there was a Nazi vision of a biologically quote-unquote pure population, and this would create what was called an Aryan master race. So this is pseudoscience, which means the claims or beliefs in a concept claim to be scientific and to be factual, but they're just incompatible with scientific method. Despite this, on July 14th, 1933, the German government put into law something called Law for the Prevention of Progeny with Hereditary Disease. This law basically mandated and forced sterilization of people with any mental or physical disabilities or someone with mental illnesses. Anyone who suffered from any of these 9 conditions met the criteria for the law. These included hereditary feeble-mindedness. How did they test this exactly? Schizophrenia, manic depressive or bipolar disorder, hereditary epilepsy, Huntington's chorea, which is a fatal form of dementia, genetic blindness, deafness, severe hereditary physical deformities, and chronic alcoholism. This law had also allowed public health officials to apply the law to people like gypsies and asocial elements who maybe rejected German social values. Holy crap, I have heard of things like the master race, and of course I have heard of Hitler and Nazis, but if you remember in a different episode, I called myself out for not knowing shiz when it comes to history. So if you could have seen my face when I read this, I was just like, oh my God. I just have to say that if those were still in law now, not only would I have not been born because one of my parents would have been sterilized, but no shit, I would not have been able to have either of my boys. That's absolutely nuts, and I cannot believe he actually thought, like Hitler actually thought, or other people actually thought that this would work. Okay, so back to Rudolf. He was supposed to be sterilized because of his epilepsy, but a few days before he was supposed to have the procedure, the operating room where this would take place was destroyed in a bombing attack. That's freaking scary. Apparently, he went on to father a child, and this child would be raised by his sister. I tried to find out more information about the child since this was so long ago. They would no longer be a child. But I couldn't find anything about them at all, which that's fine. Maybe they didn't want to claim this jerk as their father, and I get that. Rudolf apparently also worked in a labor camp as a cook and was said to have killed and eaten cats. Ugh, yuck, why? After the time where the Red Army invaded, again, I had to look this up, it said that this was a volunteer basis army of workers and peasants who revolted against the Germans. So after this invasion, Pliel was said to work as an auxiliary policeman in his village. An auxiliary policeman is someone who does things like community policing, neighborhood watch type. They do traffic policing and like riot control. It was during this time that Rudolf claimed to have shot and killed a drunken, looting Soviet soldier while robbing him. It said that Rudolf was able to escape punishment for this crime because locals allegedly helped him bury the body in the forest. Around this time, Rudolf was married, and he did impregnate his wife, but it was said that he found this marriage didn't quote-unquote satisfy his urges, so he began to attack women at night. What an ass. Later on, he stated that he started killing in 1945, but there was no proof of this. Between the years of 1946 and 1947, he would help people who paid him to cross illegally east and west. During these 2 years is when Rudolf was said to have killed women. He had 2 accomplices, one named Karl Hoffman, who was said to be born in 1913 and was a tailor of women's clothes. People thought of this man as callous and brutal and was willing to kill to get stolen goods. Rudolf's other accomplice, Konrad Schubla, was from a place called Luckersdorf and was an 18-year-old butcher at the time. These 2 buttheads would help Rudolf go on and kill at least 12 up to 25 different people. And yes, I did have a lot of the words pronounced for me on my computer, and then I wrote them out phonetically on the script so I would get them right. Then, as I was going along and I was writing there were words all over the place that I didn't know, and I just gave up on looking up every single one. I did on some and not on others, so I'm going to give it my best guess. Don't judge me. And for those listeners over in this neck of the woods, I apologize if this is going to be like nails on a chalkboard for you. I have seen on my analysis stuff that I have listeners from a bunch of different countries, so I'm glad you're here. So it said that Rudolf, along with many others inside of the German army during the war, had found their fondness for the suffering of humans while they were witnessing firsthand so many of the heinous acts against war victims at the hands of the, quote, Nazi death squads. Rudolf claimed that his first sexual experience during this time, in which he saw naked, battered bodies of people being thrown away like trash into a pit near the Gestapo, which is the political police of Nazi Germany, near his military post. So one source said that he was actually a teenage soldier when he witnessed this, which, if you remember earlier, it said that his first sexual experience was at the age of 13 with a sex worker. So maybe he saw this happening and was aroused and then had his experience with a sex worker, or maybe this was just the first time that he was aroused by something darker than what was thought to be normal for a teenage boy. It did say that Rudolf was aroused by seeing these naked, dead women. Either way, after seeing the dead bodies and having his first sexual experience, he was quoted saying it was my finest sexual experience. Gross. It was said after the war he used his new fondness for human suffering when he posed as a border guard in what was called No Man's Land near Saxony, separating the East and West. It was said around this time there were approximately 13 police officers that were murdered in the area around the border, which led the authorities to patrol in groups instead of on their own. And this made it much easier for Pliel and his two accomplices to evade the police. Rudolf's first victim was said to be a woman named Erica, who was 32 years old. When her body was found, she had been raped, robbed, and had been killed by damage to her head. On July 19th, Rudolf abused and killed a woman who was said to be 25 years old. This happened in between Wachenried and Elrich. I'm sure I butchered that, I'm sorry. And this was on the edge of southern Harz. For this murder, he used a hammer to kill his victim. This woman's body was found near Forest Road. On August 19th, Rudolf and the accomplice named Karl Hoffman had convinced a young woman said to be the age of 25 to go with them to the freight depot that was in the upper Franconian border town of Hof. When they got there, it said Hoffman stabbed this woman's head with a knife as she was assaulted. They killed this poor woman by slitting her throat. They then dropped her body down what was said to be a 7-meter well that was near the railway station. So 7 meters is around 22.9 feet. Ugh, the brutality. The next victim was a 25-year-old woman who just happened to run into Rudolf and Hoffman on September 2nd while trying to cross the border at Bergen. It said Rudolf beat this victim to death with a field stone. Then it said Hoffman buried her body in the forest. When I looked it up, because I was like, what is a field stone? It's just a stone. I don't know why it's called that specifically, but it's just like a larger stone that you would find on the ground. In the middle of September, a young 25-year-old black woman was trying to cross the border. In the forest, they ended up robbing her and then killing her. After the victim was dead, Hoffman was said to have decapitated her. Why? Her body was said to be discovered about a month after her disappearance. It was said at the end of November, Rudolf offered a young woman his assistance to try and cross the border. He guided her to the forest between Wachenried and Alrich, which Rudolf said at this point he actually suffered an alcohol-induced seizure, but that when he woke up, the girl was lying beside him and she was dead. Jesus, that's scary. The next victim was a 55-year-old widow that was first robbed by Rudolf and his other accomplice, Konrad Schubla, near Nordhausen, and this was on December 12th. They beat this woman with clubs, and despite the men leaving this woman for dead, she actually survived. She would later on testify at the trial. One source said that she actually faked being beaten into an unconscious state, and then when they left the area, she ran for safety. Wow, good for her. What a badass. 2 days after that last attack, a 37-year-old woman was killed by Rudolf inside of the guard booth of Weinenberg while Konrad kept watch. They then tossed the victim's body down a well. After this one, Rudolf went on to kill another woman on December 19th, and this woman was a 45-year-old widow, and he also put this woman's body down the well. On January 16th, 1947, Rudolf and Hoffman offered a 20-year-old young woman help with getting to the East Zone. Rudolf then proceeded to kill her near a road that runs between Abendrode and Stapelberg. They disposed of her body in a nearby stream. The next victim was attacked in the middle of February near a place called Dudersiebahn. After Rudolf killed the woman, who was said to be the age of 49, Karl was said to rob the woman of her valuables. It was said when she was found, her death was said to be severe skull damage done with an iron rod, and she had been raped. Her body was found under a stack of firewood. In the beginning of March near Zorg, which was said to be in the Soviet occupation zone, Rudolf and Karl killed a woman. Karl was said to have quote-unquote slaughtered this victim with a knife, and then she was decapitated. Then they moved her body to the British zone, and it was discovered later on. When Rudolf was finally caught and arrested, it said he wasn't actually arrested for the murders of all of these women, but rather for the murder of a merchant named Herman Bennen. And this happened in a border crossing crash. Rudolf apparently killed the man with a hatchet and a drunken stupor. He was able to escape the murder charges, but Rudolf was then charged with the crime of manslaughter because he was so heavily intoxicated during the time of the crime. While Rudolf was actually in custody is when he confessed to the murders of all of these poor women. He had been sentenced to 12 years in prison for the manslaughter charge, and it was during this time that he wrote the stories of the women he had claimed to murder. No one had taken him seriously. He claimed to have been the cause of 25 deaths. It wasn't until the memoirs he had written said to look at the bottom of the well on the outskirts of town. His memoirs were quoted saying, "They don't believe me here, that I can kill people quickly and well. Hurry up and find the bodies." Ugh, what a douche. Then he signed it Rudolf Pliel, retired killer. The authorities then collected enough evidence and his confessions to put together a case. So basically, if he wouldn't have wanted all the attention on himself and wouldn't have confessed, there's a chance that he could have gotten away with the crimes. It was also said that Rudolf had a somewhat weird set of ethics when it came to murdering people, I guess. He didn't really see anything wrong with raping and murdering women, but he was avidly against decapitation. He apparently thought that decapitation was a quote-unquote disgusting act, and once he even beat one of his accomplices when they tried to attempt to cut off one of the victims' heads. I'm sorry, so this sick fuck was like, yeah, it's fine to rape and murder women, but he draws the line with decapitation. In a newspaper article from the Sunday Herald out of Sydney, Australia, they reported that Pliel had an ape-like appearance, and he was said to bar the entrance that the young women needed to get across the border. He would say in a soft voice as to not scare the women, "Don't run, Fräulein. I'll guide you past the Russian guards." Then he would get closer to the woman and seize her, silently kill her, and then drink schnapps in a toast to himself. By the way, Fräulein is a term used to describe an unmarried German-speaking woman. After many of the bodies were found, Pliel was quoted saying, "I deserve a diploma for this. I am Germany's #1 killer after Hitler." What a piece of shit, and what a disgusting flex for this man. Asking for a trophy for being a scumbag murderer? Ugh, that pissed me off so bad. The news article went on to say that Pliel wrote the mayor of his village from his jail cell, trying to boast of his killings, and then asked to be appointed local executioner. I hate this fucker. Rudolph's trial was said to begin on October 31st, Halloween, in 1950. While he was in court, he exaggerated some of the details of his crime, and they said that he did this without any shame. I guess he was loving the attention that he was getting from the press. He constantly was said to interrupt the court proceedings to demand that he be charged with the 25 murders that he claimed to have committed, instead of the 9 that he was being charged for. Go big or go home, I guess. He was also said to deny that any of the victims had been killed for any purposes of robbery. He maintained that the random slaughtering had been, quote, necessary for my sexual satisfaction. He went on to say that, quote, what I did is not such a great harm with all these surplus of women nowadays. Anyway, I had a good time. Oh my fucking God, I want to punch this guy in his stupid face. A surplus of women? How dare you, motherfucker? He had a good time. I felt the want for revenge in that moment when I was reading this, like wishing the things that he had done to these poor women could have been done to him, and see if he thought it was a good time. And I'm not usually one for like an eye for an eye revenge, but this man tested that limit for me with his dumb remarks. Rudolf then tried to convince the court that he was insane, but apparently he failed. On November 17, 1950, Rudolf and his accomplices were found guilty of their crimes, and each one of them was sentenced to life in prison. When Rudolf was in prison, he wrote his memoirs, which were titled Mein Kampf. And the subtitle was Rudolf Pliel, Death Dealer, and in parentheses said retired. Good Lord, this man certainly has a very grandiose sense of self. So I had to look up what Mein Kampf meant because I was curious, and when I researched it, I found out that Mein Kampf was a 1925 autobiographical manifesto by the notorious Nazi leader himself, Adolf Hitler. I thought it sounded familiar, but I don't want to take any guesses when it comes to history because I'm a history moron. So I guess Rudolf fancied himself just like Hitler and was apparently just dying for attention. That's all this screams to me, as a man-child who didn't get enough attention as a child and wanted to be known for how awful he was. I mean, I guess they do say that bad attention is still attention, so I guess he got what he wanted? I don't know, what a freak. So how these quote-unquote memoirs came to light is actually an interesting story. So apparently another criminal named Erich Dollner, who was formerly in the Celle prison, which is also the place that Rudolf Pliel would serve his sentence, was said to have gotten out the day before Christmas Eve in 1957. When I looked up this prison, it said Celle is a town and capital of the district Celle in Lower Saxony, which is in north-central Germany. Geography is another non-strong suit of mine. Dollner was released early on probation. He was said to have walked through the Celle prison gates, and he was carrying a heavy briefcase under his arm. I guess he secretly had this briefcase made in a workshop inside the prison. This briefcase was said to have contained two secrets: a false bottom, and it contained the memoirs of Rudolf Pliel. Dollner said the reason that he was able to have these memoirs was for two main factors. He said that he had privileged position as the custodian and the fact that Rudolf had an enormous need to communicate. Court psychiatrists would later define this need to communicate, quote, strange and absurd urge to reveal. After Rudolf was sent to Celle prison, again for the second time, and this time it was for life, he continued his writings to even more extent. He apparently wrote countless petitions to the public sector and to the police in Braunschweig, as he described his conviction as the, quote, greatest miscarriage of justice of all time. He said in reality he had only murdered 4 times, and that he actually had taken on the other 5 cases, quote, because I was always hungry and greedy for tobacco. The criminal police gave me food and tobacco products, and because I was counting on being placed in a sanatorium and care facility, end quote. So it seems like Rudolf wanted all the attention in the world when he thought that he was going to get off easier at a mental health facility, but now that he was in prison, he was screaming to the world how unfair it was. He's like a giant child. I cannot believe he actually wrote the police saying, no, I only killed 4 people, not 9. Like, what the hell? You're still a giant piece of shit, dude. I think he said 9 because those are the ones that the authorities could prove in the end. Also, while Rudolf was in prison, he claimed to have developed a way of expressing himself with knowledge, teaching, and some prison psychology. I'm not sure what prison psychology is, but all right. He went on to say that through the many days he spent alone, that he'd become closer to God. Apparently, it was evident that Rudolf really felt serious about this prison psychology from a labeled drawing that he made when he summarized his anatomical knowledge of humans, and then said he was able to identify a soul in a herring, but not in a human. He asked, "So where is the soul?" Oh man, he is so deep. Dude, where's your fucking soul? There was said to be a criminal psychologist named Ulrich Zander that analyzed Rudolf Pliel and said that he was not stupid, but rather devious. He examined a letter written by Pliel and said he described the letter as showing a clear picture of what Rudolf's narcissism and egomania was like, especially when he boasted of having a special talent as the, quote, dead maker. I knew that he was a narcissist. I nailed that. Do you guys have any narcissistic people in your lives? It is interesting, to say the least. You know what? This is a good place to actually help anyone who doesn't know what narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, is, because he is a great example. So, in a mental health article on helpguide.org, the way they described it was awesome. The article says, quote, "In psychological terms, narcissism doesn't mean self-love, at least not of a genuine sort. It's more accurate to say that people with narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, are in love with an idealized, grandiose image of themselves. And they're in love with this inflated self-image precisely because it allows them to avoid deep feelings of insecurity," end quote. And that's exactly right. Like, people with NPD are often arrogant, have lack of empathy or consideration for other people, and they have an excessive need for admiration. Some people describe other people with NPD as cocky, manipulative, selfish, patronizing, and demanding. People that have this also tend to be extremely resistant to trying to change their own behavior. So the person who has this that I know of in my own life was my abuser from a past relationship. And I didn't realize he was like this until I got out of that relationship and had realized that he fit into every single aspect of this category. I often wonder if people who suffer from this know they have this, or if they just refuse to ever believe it because they think so highly of themselves. What do you think? Now that you have this definition of this personality disorder, do you have anyone in your own lives who fits this? Because if so, I'm curious to know how that relationship is, or how it went, or even where it stands. Okay, back to Rudolf. A former prison chaplain named Erich Helmer recounted a time he was allowed to visit Rudolf, which was always under supervision because he was considered dangerous. Remembering this one visit in particular, he stated that Rudolf was in his cell and he was crying. Rudolf then showed Erich a letter from England where women of the Christian faith had written saying that they were praying for him. There was said to be a documentary about Rudolf Pliel called The Dead Maker, Rudolf Pliel, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not find it in English or even a translated transcript to at least read. Believe you me, your girl did some research on this case and translated different websites from German. Like, I did anything and everything that I could for this case. It was a good one. On February 16th, 1958, Rudolf was found dead in his prison cell. He had hung himself with a towel inside of his solitary confinement cell. He was 33 years old. It was said that he had grown bored in prison because newspapers had stopped visiting him for stories and he started to become old news. It was also mentioned that Rudolf had already said that he was going to hang himself at some point. Karl Hoffmann died in prison in 1976, and Conrad was apparently pardoned in the late 70s. Gross. It actually doesn't really surprise me that he grew bored in prison and decided on suicide, because the amount of attention this man apparently needed to survive is a level that I will never know or understand. I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that he would rather go to prison again after already having to serve 12 years to end up being sentenced to life in prison because he wanted people to know what he had done. He wanted his name to be out there for all of time. One source had said that one of the notebooks Rudolf wrote had a title, quote, "Without mercy, I will kill the child and the old man, and after 100 years, one should still speak of me." Gross. I hate people like him who actually don't give a shit who they affect or what they do wrong as long as all eyes are on them. Like, their need to be special and important to people surpasses any logic or rationale. I wonder how his child turned out. I hope that poor kid grew up to do all right and didn't have any problems of their own. And that, my friends, is the awful, sad, and honestly just irritating story of Rudolf Pliel. Smuggler, cat eater, rapist, and murderer with a grandiose sense of self. This story was so interesting to me because just the pure curiosity that I have of motives or why people are the way they are, I guess that question is always beckoning if people are born this way or if something they experience early on in life is the reason that people turn out the way they do. In my own personal opinion, I feel like it's both. I think murderers are made, and I do feel like some people are just born a certain way as well. I won't say evil because I personally don't really believe in evil things per se, but I will say that people can be just fucked up, and we see that a lot. Some people are just wired in a way that makes them have some kinds of needs or wants that can just not be satisfied until they do things that are just awful. We often hear it described as like a hunger or something that they just can't turn off. I am so grateful in my own life that I don't have these types of addictions or cravings or whatever. I can't even imagine. The only hunger that I have in my own personal life is for pickles. Endless amounts of pickles and pickle juice. And if you know me in my personal life, you know that I'm not lying. All right, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I will see you guys next week for another episode of The Kill File. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and listening to another episode of The Kill File. If you want to share your thoughts on what we covered today, suggest a case for me to check out, or if you're just bored and looking for something to do, you can head over to The Kill File's social medias and reach out. We're on Facebook and Instagram as The Kill File, and we're on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out our website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host, and a little bit more about how The Kill File got started. I love hearing from you guys. Come back on Mondays, wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, when we will cover another case on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye!